Okay, well, welcome, everybody on the internet. Kwe and Dalawazi David Webster, Ndaloka Pomozo Winakchi Bishops. So, I'm David Webster. I teach at Bishop's University here. So, welcome on this beautiful, bracing evening on Ndakina, the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people. Bienvenue au territoire non cédé du peuple Abenaki. Just want to acknowledge the land we're on and the rivers and the mountains and the animals who are on it, but most importantly, the people who are on it. I want to acknowledge that this land was taken from the Abenaki people who still use it in an act of colonial violence and dispossession that continues to this day. And that the land has meant many things to many people, one of which is refuge, which is tonight's topic. And that's all I'm going to say now. Over to you.
Thank you, David.
Glenn.
Hi, everyone. My name is Glenn Patterson. I'm with the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, and I'm the one that brought in all these suitcases and all these cameras and lights. So the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network is all about helping small museums, historical societies, in the province, and we've got some excellent help from some of our member organizations. I want to shout out Julie Marleau from Upland. She helped me set up the tech, as well as Jody Robinson from the ETRC last night. We were here testing. I was showing them how everything works, and they were super helpful today. So shout out to you guys. And for the people watching online, tell us where you're from. You can leave questions in the comment box. And I'll relay them to our speaker during the Q&A session, and that's all I want to say for now.
Hi, me again. So I'm here now to introduce tonight's Robin Burns lecture on behalf of the ETRC, the Eastern Townships Resource Centre. So it's actually a real honor to be able to introduce Laura Madokoro as the Robin Burns lecturer for this year. What can I say? Dr. Madokoro is a professor of history at Carleton University right now, and she's also a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists, amongst her other prestigious recognitions. She's a graduate of the University of British Columbia, but of course, even more important, a graduate of Alexander Galt High School, which is clearly, she's a townshipper. So it's really good to have Dr. Madokoro back, and I'm sure family members agree. She's previously, before teaching at Carleton, she was a professor of history at McGill University, so certainly well aware of the local situation. She's the author of the wonderful book, Elusive Refuge, Chinese Migrants in the Cold War, which is published by Harvard University Press a few years back. Elusive Refuge received the Association of Asian Studies Best Book in the Social Science Award, Social Sciences Award. It won the Chinese Canadian Historical Society's Ed Wickberg Prize, named for a UBC professor, yeah? And the Mershon Center's Furness Book Award. She's also published extensively on Chinese, Japanese, Cambodian, and many other refugee communities coming to what is now Canada, and on published important work on the international refugee regime, which feeds into her current project, which she'll be talking about tonight, on the history of refuge and sanctuary beyond cities, so including very close to this community. Yeah, and she's active in the profession in all sorts of ways, such as being one of the editors of the wonderful history website activehistory.ca and publishing widely in The Conversation and in other publications. So really, to me, one of the models of an engaged historian who doesn't just do history academically, but applies history to really important current issues. So I'm really glad she's back in the townships. Welcome, Dr. Madokoro. May I hand over to you?
Thank you so much, David. I have to say, one of the reasons I accepted the invitation was I knew David would do the welcome and the introduction, and I knew it would make my ego soar. So thank you very much for that. Thank you, Jody and Glenn and Julie, for all the organizing that's gone into this event. I know how much work it is to put together an event, especially a hybrid one where you're thinking about online communities and people in person. So hello to people here in the room, hello to people online. It is such a pleasure to be back here in the Eastern Townships on the campus of Bishops and Champlain, where I spent many, many hours as a child and as a student at Champlain College. So it's just really, really wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be here with family and friends who have known me since I was very, very little. And so thank you to everyone for coming tonight. It is awfully chilly out there, but it is nice and warm in the room. There are also some students who I have the pleasure of working with who are here tonight, so thank you as well. I'm going to speak about some broad themes related to the question of sanctuary. As David mentioned, I've been working and thinking about this topic for many years now, and I will try and draw together some themes that are related to this question of sanctuary, which has been a contemporary topic in many ways, but one that has deep, deep historical roots. And I will also try and weave in some townships history because it is near and dear to my heart. So with that, let us figure out this clicker. I assume I hit the arrow?
Yes. If it doesn't move, hit the other arrow.
You know what? The other arrow is completely erased, which is how you know that that's the one that you should be touching. Thank you. So this church will be familiar to some of you in the room. This is Plymouth-Trinity United Church in Sherbrooke. So on the 8th of November 2021, just a little over 2 years ago now, Rodriguez-Flores, Manuel Rodriguez, and their son Manolo entered into sanctuary in this church, which is located quite close to the Grande Fourche area, long a meeting place of waterways and people. They were evading a deportation order that would have returned them to Mexico, a country they had fled for fear of violent persecution at the hands of notorious and ruthless drug cartels. Their time in Canada had been marked by a series of applications, refusals, appeals, and previous returns, and they were at the end of the line in terms of legal avenues. In entering sanctuary, the Flores-Rodriguez family, as they became known in the media, were participating in a centuries-old practice, and also one that has changed significantly in substance and style in recent decades, particularly with the rise of the sanctuary city movement in the early 2000s. The idea of sanctuary, as it is conventionally understood, relates to medieval practices, especially in England, though also to some extent in France, where people accused of criminal matters could take sanctuary in designated churches in the hopes of securing some kind of peace, pardon, or other solution. Now, this is a somewhat limited definition in that it fails to account for indigenous practices of sanctuary based on kinship and adoption, but it is nevertheless the dominant framing in North America, and certainly one that has been deeply influential in recent years. Whoops, did I just shut it off? I think I just shut it off. Oh, it's back on again. It's going to keep you all on your toes. Keep me on my toes as well. Now, in the medieval European context, the practice of sanctuary is legally prescribed in terms of who could seek sanctuary, the responsibilities for offering sanctuary, and the conditions of sanctuary, though of course these often varied in practice. For instance, as historian Shannon McSheffrey has shown in her remarkable book, which I put up on the screen there, Seeking Sanctuary, the time in sanctuary was meant to be limited to 40 days, and the processes for entering and departing from sanctuary were strictly regulated. The legal practice of sanctuary in medieval England began to decline in 1534 and had been terminated entirely by 1623 as a result of a contest between sovereign and religious authorities over power and privilege in the realm. And in some ways, it is this contest or this tension between competing authorities that has endured into the present, rather than the actual practice of sanctuary as it operated in medieval England. So what I want to do tonight is actually spend some time thinking through about the similarities and differences between the kind of received definition that we have from these medieval practices and the way that it's been repurposed and used in recent years and over the past few decades. The idea of sanctuary, now let me try and do this without shutting off the screen. Excellent, okay. warming up now. The idea of sanctuary was revived in substantial ways in the 1980s in the United States and Canada, when thousands of refugees fleeing the, quote, dirty wars, funded in part by the Reagan administration and orchestrated by the CIA in Central America, made their way to the United States only to have their claims to asylum roundly dismissed. As religious and secular activists became involved, they discovered a disproportionate number of refusals, meaning that people from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua were trying to seek refuge in the United States only to have their claims turned down, and then they themselves were deported. And so they became very concerned about the relationship between what was going on in Central America and what was happening in the United States. So on the 24th of March, 1982, Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, which is pictured on the slide on the left, along with a coalition of churches in the Bay Area and San Francisco, announced that they would be a sanctuary for Central American refugees fleeing persecution. And this is a reproduction of the banners that were hung in the church on that day and essentially said no border control can enter these spaces. So the idea was to create safe spaces for people fleeing persecution in the bid to try and secure asylum for them in the United States. And Canada also became part of this story. The sanctuary movement of the 1980s, which was described by contemporaries as a, quote, new underground railroad, has been profoundly influential in shaping contemporary refugee and immigration practices, including declarations by certain municipalities that they are sanctuary cities. This phenomena, which can also trace its roots to ancient traditions, including the biblical cities of refuge, free cities of Europe, became very pronounced in the early 2000s and was especially prevalent during the Trump administration's time in office and its efforts to increase deportations and criminalize migration. The premise behind sanctuary cities, or what are sometimes called solidarity cities, is that people without legal status should be able to access services without being unduly penalized. So for instance, if you were stopped for a minor traffic violation and a police officer discovered that you didn't have legal status, they wouldn't reveal that information to federal authorities. The idea was that you should say you should be safe in your community regardless of your legal status, especially if there was no major criminality involved. And this extended to school boards, making sure that children could access school services, and also to health care. And so in our age of migration regulation and control, there are now an estimated 500 sanctuary cities, campuses, and states or other such jurisdictions in North America and Europe. And so this is a very recent phenomenon, but it is one that builds on these earlier traditions. In my reading of these developments, sanctuary or refuge is a significant phenomenon, one that is reflective of the political, social, economic, and cultural dimensions of any given period. However, as I hope to show in this talk, the practice of sanctuary is never limited or isolated to a single site, such as the Plymouth-Trinity United Church that I showed in that first slide, or in the case of the Flores-Rodriguez family, or in the case of municipalities such as Montreal, which have declared themselves sanctuary cities. Montreal flirted with the designation for about 2 years before deciding that it couldn't actually be a sanctuary city in practice and that it would be a responsible or caring city. What I want to do is show that sanctuary as a practice results from a diversity of networks and contingencies and is therefore revealing of how communities are connected in myriad ways with events and people in places that are often quite far afield. In other words, in thinking about sanctuary, we need to move beyond particular sites of sanctuary and think about all the connections that bring people to particular places at particular moments in time. And it is fitting for me to be offering these comments here tonight as you all know, I had the great fortune of growing up here on the traditional lands of the Abenaki people, and I still consider the Eastern Townships home. I think my interest in notions of sanctuary, which is now going into a decade of work, community, hospitality, and protection are all rooted here in this place, even if they have taken on an academic gaze in recent years. Like many others, my parents made a deliberate decision to live here, and all through my childhood, the notion of community was strongly emphasized, which is why it's so meaningful to have so many people here tonight that I've known for so long. And as you well know, community can be fraught. It's not always easy, but it is also a source of strength, especially when there's a sense of being targeted, as we have seen in recent initiatives by the Legault government that have deliberately and expressly targeted English language rights. So my own sense of this place and my enduring sense of community stems from these long-standing connections with friends and neighbors, as well as the stories of refuge and solidarity that are woven through place and landscape. I'm thinking of stories that I've heard over the years of people making deliberate choices to live here instead of somewhere else. And I'm also thinking about the stories that have been handed down, reinterpreted across the generations about refuge in this particular place and elsewhere. So I will use a local example just to kind of give you a sense of some of the things I've been thinking of, and then I'll move into a historical example that shows us both the relationship between sanctuary in a city and beyond the city. So we're going to take a poll. I can't do the poll online, I'm sorry, but I'll do it in person. So I'm curious about how many people in the room know the story of Donald Morrison. Can you put your hands up? Right, okay. So there maybe is a generational divide, if I might be so bold as to observe this. So, well, this is great because it gives me a chance to tell you the story of Donald Morrison. And those of you who raised your hands, who probably know the history better than I do, you can correct me. This is an invitation to get into some details. Oops, that's not the image I want to show you. So the image on the left is Donald Morrison, who is the so-called outlaw of Megantic. Donald Morrison was born to Murdo and Sophia Morrison in 1858, and at the age of 18, he went, and I should say he was born here in the Eastern Townships. At the age of 18, Donald went west in search of adventure and financial gain. However, he returned 7 years later in the spring of 1883 after learning that his family's farm was in financial jeopardy. And there was a great deal at stake. The farm had been promised to him, and its precarious status meant that his own future well-being was at risk. So in order to save his family's property, Donald proceeded through a series of complicated legal and financial transactions over the following 3 years to no avail. And so in the end, a French-Canadian farmer by the name of Antoine Duquette eventually purchased the farm from the bank. And shortly after taking possession, shots were fired into the Duquette family's dining room. One bullet became lodged in the grandfather clock for all to see. And on the 8th of May, 1888, the barn burned down. So despite protestations of innocence echoed by friends and supporters who sympathized in part because of the precarity of their own financial position in an era of rapid economic change, a warrant was issued for Donald Morrison's arrest. And when local law enforcement failed to apprehend Morrison, and the story on the ground is that they didn't want to apprehend one of their own, provincial authorities deputized Jack Warren, an American and a rumored liquor trader who frequented the American House Bar in Megantic and professed himself eager to undertake the hunt. On the 22nd of June, 1888, at around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Warren confronted Morrison in the streets of the village. A duel resulted, and Warren was killed. Morrison fled and went into hiding, and police, and this is where the stories of refuge, I think, take on quite magnificent tones in terms of the local community. Lots of stories of Morrison being hidden under beds in people's homes, lots of Gaelic being spoken so that authorities from far and wide who didn't speak the language wouldn't understand what was being said. And authorities did come from Montreal and Quebec City in an effort to apprehend Morrison, with little success. In October of 1888, the provincial government announced a reward of $1,200 for his arrest, which was a significant amount. And even with this large financial sum on offer, Morrison continued to evade the police with the help of the local community. And here the stories of refuge and protection become very, very powerful. Really stories of people resisting the police authority and really protecting one of their own, hiding him in the woods, in their homes, and really, in a way, in the sense, if we were to tie it back to Western traditions of sanctuary, there are also stories of local priests sort of spreading the word of how to protect Morrison. So the effort to apprehend Morrison was protracted, and it became one of the longest manhunts in Canadian history. In December 1888, the provincial government issued a proclamation that indicated that anyone who afforded him, quote, any help whatsoever would be, quote, liable to arrest and imprisonment for 2 years. So the stakes kept going higher and higher. Still, the declaration had little effect, and in the spring of 1889, after a long winter, the provincial Parti National, the Liberal government of Honoré Mercier, declared martial law in the area. And Premier Mercier appointed Judge Amitié Dugas to take charge of apprehending Donald Morrison. So the stakes, as I say, just kept getting higher and higher. Police and detectives came from Montreal, again trying to capture Morrison and his supporters for harboring a wanted criminal. The hunt continued, and a truce was ultimately arranged for the 1889 Easter weekend. On Saturday, April 20th, Morrison was spotted having tea with his mother. And as he left his parents' house later that evening, he was confronted by Sergeant James McMahon and Pierre Leroyer, who was also known as Pete Leroyer. Morrison was shot in the leg, arrested, and later transported to the Sherbrooke jail, where he awaited trial. Morrison spent a total of 174 days in jail and in court before being found guilty of murder. Although the jury recommended a modest sentence, given Morrison's claims of self-defense, Judge Brooks sentenced the outlaw to 18 years in jail, a sentence that many found shocking in its severity at the time. And it's important to underscore that this was a sentence that was directed not only at Morrison, but also at the community that had sheltered him. So Morrison ultimately spent 5 years in prison before the federal Minister of Justice, John Thompson, approved the recommendations for his early release in 1894. His health was deteriorating at the time, and it was seen as a humanitarian gesture. Morrison died a few hours later at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal of pulmonary consumption. And the Caledonian Society, a Scottish association that gathered the elites of Montreal society, arranged for his body to travel to the Eastern Townships, where he was buried in Gisela Cemetery, with a funeral wreath that was also provided by the society's membership. And I was just saying to Jody before the talk that the Eastern Townships Resource Centre actually has an amazing image of this wreath, and I should have included it in the PowerPoint, but did not. I'll remember for next time. It's online, everyone, it's online. There's still regular community visits to the gravesite, and as of 2016, the house where Morrison made his last stand has been turned into the Donald Morrison Museum. So there's an image of the museum there, which unfortunately, because I don't get to spend enough time in the townships anymore, I haven't yet visited. But this is a story that has been told in countless ways by various historians and community members here. And it's a story that I grew up with. I actually don't remember the first time I heard the story, but I think it's very much a story that celebrates community and fosters respect for community, and also the idea that certain people are deserving of protection, even if the authorities don't think so. So it's deep, deep, deep in my memory. And I've returned to the story of Donald Morrison on a number of occasions in my academic research, most recently in thinking through the ways in which events in one place are woven together with networks in others. And so in this case, I've been thinking through the fact that the police officers who came from Montreal and Quebec City were very much outsiders, and yet it was the Caledonian Society, which in some ways was an outsider organization in that it was based in Montreal, but ultimately was the organization that brought Morrison's remains home. So I'm thinking about these different connections, and it's very much underpinning my talk tonight. I will note with interest that this story seems to be taking on a new shape and form, and I had a very, I will figure out these. By the end of the talk, I will have figured out the arrows. The story keeps getting reinvented. So I've taken interest in the story because of my questions around refuge and sanctuary. On the screen is the author Amy Tector, who is also a townshipper who grew up in Knowlton, and she has also taken up the story of Donald Morrison in her recent work, or it's her forthcoming work, which is a work of fiction and somehow involves a pot of gold. I don't think I'm revealing the plot line too much, but Honor the Dead will be out in the spring, and Amy will be here at the National Storytelling Conference next summer, which my mom is organizing. So there are all kinds of connections. It might be a generational thing. I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I do think as we seek to connect with community and place in this highly virtual world, there is an interest in the kind of evidence and the power of story, and especially the power of story to connect and bind people to particular places. So the story of the Outlaw of Megantic was certainly at the back of my mind as I put together research on the history of sanctuary. And as David mentioned, this talk, which I will eventually get to, is based on a book that I'm working on, which is currently called Sanctuary in Pieces, 200 Years of Flight, Fugitivity, and Resistance in a North American City. And it's about the history of sanctuary in Montreal, but the way that that sanctuary is connected across time and place. And it's a series of 6 different case studies, and I've had the really great pleasure of interviewing many people here for this project. So Jackie Hyman's in the audience and was one of the people I interviewed for the chapter on American war resistors during the American War in Vietnam. This is the cover art for the book, which was done by Mary Harmon, who is an American war resistor living in Vale Perkins. And in writing this book, which really has taken a decade at this point, I was interested in understanding how ideas and practices of sanctuary have changed over time. And so I chose the city of Montreal as a study and considered the ways in which people have sought or forged refuge in this one particular place, but I was really paying attention to the networks that shaped that history. And in tracing this history, I was interested in understanding the lived experience of sanctuary. I wanted as much as possible to understand what options were available to people, how it felt to be in sanctuary, and what the larger implications were around the decision to seek or offer refuge. And although my focus was on the experience of sanctuary in one North American city, one thing that became very, very clear from the outset is that any kind of sanctuary is a deeply, deeply networked phenomena. It is contingent on connections and relationships that span all kinds of borders and divisions. In other words, it goes far beyond any particular place and far beyond the city, if you will. So I did manage to connect it to the actual title of the talk. So given the spirit of the Robin Burns lecture, I thought it'd be helpful to share one story from the late 19th century that has connections beyond the city, to the United States, to rural Quebec, to Europe, and in a parallel and somewhat connected way to the Eastern Townships. So I'm going to do another poll now. I'm really making you work tonight, but it's end of November. Of course, we all have lots of energy at this time of the semester. How many of you have heard of John Harrison Surratt? Yes, there's a hand, yay. I won't put you on the spot to actually tell the history. Okay, well, this is great. I will get into it then. I will say that I came to this story in part because I was working on the first chapter of the book, which is about the so-called Underground Railroad, and I was really surprised at how little movement there was to Montreal in this context. Very few fugitive slaves made their way to Montreal and stayed in the era of the so-called Underground Railroad, and in fact, there is what some historians call a Southern Railroad, in that people moved from British North America to Vermont after slavery was outlawed in that state's constitution in 1777. So that was the context. I was thinking about the Underground Railroad, I was thinking about fugitive slaves, and to speak to the work of small museums and resource centers, it was an archivist in rural Quebec who said, "Have you heard of John Harrison Surratt?" And I said, "No." And so this is the story that I will share now. This is John Harrison Surratt. I'll explain why he's wearing what he's wearing in a moment. So John Harrison Surratt was a Confederate messenger and a suspected conspirator in the murder of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated on the 14th of April, 1865 by John Wilkes Booth. The Shakespearean actor did not act alone, however, and in the aftermath of the assassination, 4 other people were tried and executed for their plot in the alleged conspiracy. These people included Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, and David Harold. Mary Surratt, who owned the boarding house where John Wilkes Booth hatched his plan and allegedly supported him in his efforts, was also hung for her alleged involvement, becoming the first woman to be federally executed in the United States. Mary Surratt's son, John Harrison, was also named in the conspiracy, but he fled north to Canada and later Europe in a bid to evade arrest. In doing so, Surratt benefited from religious and political networks, namely Catholic and Confederate ones, that stretched far and wide to remain highly mobile, which itself was a form of protection compared to the very rooted conditions in which his mother found herself. She was very much tied to the boarding house. Unlike her son, Mary Surratt was trapped, bound by her ownership of a boarding house that had ironically served as a safe house for others in the Confederate cause. John Harrison was one of 3 children born to Mary Elizabeth Jenkins and John Surratt. And as was generally the case in the United States in the late 19th century, John Surratt and his siblings grew up in a religious household. As a child, he attended St. Thomas, a Jesuit establishment, and then St. Charles College, a Sulpician minor seminary near Ellicott's Mills in Howard County, Maryland. Surratt spent only a brief time there, as his studies were cut short by the start of the Civil War in the United States and the death of his father. Still, it was an important time, for it was here that some of the networks that would later protect him during his time in fugitivity were born. Departing from the seminary, Surratt returned to Surrattsville, so his family was well connected, they had a town named after them, where he took up his father's position as postmaster and helped his mother run the family's tavern. As the tavern doubled as the local post office, it became, quote, a natural stopping point for travelers and soon became a center for secessionist activity as a result of the family's Confederate sympathies and the ease with which correspondence could be distributed. According to Surratt, he became involved with Confederate forces upon his return to Surrattsville. He describes, quote, sending information regarding the movements of the United States Army stationed in Washington and elsewhere and carrying dispatches to Confederate boats on the Potomac. The Surratt family was certainly sympathetic to the Confederate cause from the outset. During what has been described as a vast civil war, both the provinces of Canada East and Canada West were the site of Confederate organizing, and cities were especially implicated. Montreal's close proximity to the United States and the many people in the city who supported the Confederate cause, if not necessarily slavery, made it an ideal site in which to organize and potentially wage war against the Union. The Confederate presence in the city included officials from the Confederate States of America and later prisoners of war who escaped and made their way north. And this is an image of St. Lawrence Hall, which was one of the key organizing centers for the Confederates. Jacob Thompson, who was a Confederate commissioner in Canada, had his official headquarters established here. There were so many Southerners in Montreal that the bar in St. Lawrence Hall served mint juleps. It was a very, very active community. Thompson used this space to distribute funds for planning covert operations, and this included a plan to free Confederate prisoners held at Johnson's Island, a Union prisoner camp on the shores of Lake Erie. The heightened activity in Montreal led to a brazen attack by Confederate raiders on St. Albans, Vermont, situated about 110 kilometers from Montreal. On the 19th of October, 1864, Confederates who had been quietly amassing in St. Albans, Vermont, posing as Canadian visitors, launched an attack. They began by robbing 3 banks to obtain funds to support the Confederate cause and proceeded to hold a number of people hostage in the village green before ultimately trying to burn the village to the ground, and 1 person died in the violence. These raiders fled to Canada, seeking refuge, as well as legal protection, and they were welcomed by their southern counterparts in the city, as well as by many sympathetic citizens. As one participant account detailed, and I quote, "The prisoners were confined in the jail, but received the kindest attention possible from the jailer and his family. Indeed, the jailer set aside his parlors for the accommodation of the prisoners." The account notes further, the large number of Southern people who were sojourning in Montreal vied with each other in kindness to the prisoners. The citizens of the city were equally conspicuous in their manifestations of friendship, sympathy, and courteous attentions. In a critical ruling, the justices determined that because the raiders or, quote, soldiers were under Confederate orders and because the province of Canada was officially neutral, they could not be extradited to face criminal proceedings in the United States. So Montreal really became a safe space for the raiders. Tried in Canada, they were quickly set free, much to the outrage of U.S. consular representatives in the country. Historians note that the raiders celebrated the release in a number of safe houses outside of Montreal, hinting at the network of supporters in the city and surrounds. Writing from Montreal, the American consul was dismayed at the court's decision, describing the entire proceedings as a mere farce. News clippings reported that the crowd in the courtroom cheered upon the dismissal. These news reports were similarly dispatched to Washington, as was correspondence about how Montreal had become a hub for refugees from the South, too cowardly to stay at home and fight. Nevertheless, despite the celebrations, the raiders' return and release inspired in some quarters. Overall, the climate in Montreal cooled to the Confederate cause. It was still an appealing site of refuge, but it became much more difficult to use the city as an operating base after St. Albans. The raid had inadvertently negatively affected ideas about how the city should be used. And so issues around authority, the rule of law, justice, and the right of asylum all came to the fore. So there was increased patrolling at the Canada-US border after the St. Albans raid, but it did nothing to dissuade John Surratt after Lincoln's assassination, who easily made his way north to the border. However, the border is an important story here in terms of how we think about refuge and how people think about places being safe. But what's important about Surat's story, and which I hope to show in my subsequent comments, is that the trajectory of his subsequent movements had as much to do with the border as who was willing to assist him. And so here I really want to make the point about how important human connections are in the shaping of refuge beyond physical sites of refuge. I'll just show you our friend John Surratt again. There we are. I am going to get to explaining his costume in just a moment. So in April 1865, Surratt was 21 years old. He was working as a messenger for General Robert Edward Lee. And within days of Lincoln's assassination, notices had appeared that Surratt was a suspected accomplice and that there was a bounty of $25,000 on his head. He had actually just returned from Montreal and was in Upper New York State at the time of the assassination. He heard news of the events in Washington and later saw a notice for his arrest. So he immediately went into hiding. And his first plan was to go to Montreal via St. Albans, which had been the site of the raid, and then he ultimately made his way up to the city. And as I mentioned, after the St. Albans raid, Montreal was already starting to be a bit of a cooler climate in terms of Confederate organizing. And this became even more so the case after the assassination. There was a lot less support for the Confederate cause as people decided that they didn't want to be associated with something so nefarious. The result was a groundswell of support in official quarters, especially for Union forces. So when Governor General Charles Monk received news that, quote, persons who had planned the assassination of Lincoln were on their way to Quebec, he promised his full assistance. There were spontaneous groups of vigilante citizens who also organized themselves to patrol the border with the intention of apprehending any suspected assassins. Yet despite these efforts, John Surratt arrived in the city on April 16, 1865. He checked into the St. Lawrence Hotel, the same place that was on the screen previously, using the alias Charlie Armstrong. And the clerk at the desk described him as, quote, being a tall man, 24 or 25 years old, no beard or whiskers, light brown hair, and not very gentlemanly in appearance. From there, he sheltered with John Porterfield, a Confederate agent originally from Nashville, Tennessee, whom Surratt described as, quote, a poor man with a large family, and yet money could not buy him. So he found shelter with this particular individual. From Montreal, Surratt's movements become much more dynamic. Montreal was soon crawling with detectives and police, both from the United States and from other parts of the country. Surratt himself described Montreal as not safe, detectives about everywhere. He evaded law enforcement by leaving Porterfield's residence with another support at the same time, and they each went in a different taxi, so the detectives didn't know where to follow. A man previously engaged to take him across the river did so, and a young lady, and I'm quoting here, guided him across the country to a village on the Grand Trunk Railroad called Saint-Leben or Saint-Liboire. Whoops, that didn't work. Okay. This is anticipating his next movement. So I'm going to tell you the story of Saint-Liboire, and then you know that he's going across the pond. And Saint-Liboire, Surratt was sheltered by Father Charles Boucher, a local Catholic priest. Born in Trois-Rivières on the north shore of the St. Lawrence, Boucher's father was a master carpenter. Little else is known about the priest, but it appears that he was in his second year of service when Surratt arrived in the small village. And according to all available accounts, Father Boucher did not know Surratt was a wanted accomplice in Lincoln's murder, but knew only that a Catholic American was in ill health and needed to recover from his bouts of chills. So Surratt really is hiding at this point. He's not revealing who he is. The whole point is to remain unnoticed, unlocatable, and this is a critical difference if we think about the kind of mediatized coverage of sanctuary in the present. The Catholic connection in this story is interesting, as there were immediate allegations following Lincoln's assassination that Surratt was hiding with Roman Catholic faithful. C.H. Buckley, who was a former chaplain in the military, immediately targeted Surratt's faith. In correspondence with the Secretary of War, Buckley observed that Surratt had once been, quote, patronized and petted by the priests of Georgetown, and he insisted that since Surratt hadn't been found, he must have taken refuge in one of their monastic or conventional establishments. To make his case, Buckley further charged, as the papal government only has shown favor to the Southern Rebellion, and as the loyalty of a large proportion of the Catholic clergy is, to say the least, questionable, is not the presumption fair that Surratt is harbored in some of their secret sanctuaries, most likely in Georgetown. So Buckley was correct to suspect a Catholic refuge, but he was mistaken in that Surratt had already left the United States. As it was, Surratt spent about 4 months in Saint-Liboire. He was hidden in a room from which he, quote, never came out except a few times when he would go out late at night and take a walk. So again, the idea that he's really trying to stay below the radar. He reportedly received regular correspondence from friends and acquaintances who assured him that all was going well with his mother's trial, when in fact it was not. And he really was kept removed from a great deal of news about what was happening in the United States. Surratt was eventually uncovered in Saint-Liboire when the priest's young maid apparently discovered him in a back room, and so he was quickly whisked away to Montreal, and then quickly whisked away again to Liverpool. The concern was that if he stayed in Canada, he actually would be apprehended by U.S. forces. Despite Surratt's efforts at subterfuge, the American consul in Quebec was able to report that Surratt was in Canada. And the consul was also worried or suspected that the Catholic Church was indeed the one protecting Surratt. There were all kinds of references to previous people who'd been hidden by the Catholic Church, including Dr. Luke Blackburn, a Confederate runner and one of the St. Albans raiders. Blackburn had been arrested in May 1865 for his involvement in a plot to murder people in the northern United States by mailing clothing infected with yellow fever. So Potter made pointed reference to the fact that Catholic institutions had sheltered Blackburn and implied they were doing the same with Surratt. So we can kind of see the tensions between political and religious authorities here. Still, despite Potter's alerts, Surratt was able to move quite carefully, but nevertheless move in Montreal. Nevertheless, the geographic proximity to the United States was both convenient, but also ultimately came to be seen as a problem. So when he could, he set sail for Liverpool, leaving Canada in September 1865. And in Liverpool, Surratt went directly to the Oratory of the Holy Cross, where he received another welcome from a Catholic priest. He was sheltered by Father Charles Constant Jolivet, and the same, now somewhat cliched accounts of hiding in an obscure room or closet characterized his time in Liverpool. Significantly, by the fall of 1865, there was a lot less urgency around the issue of sanctuary and arrest, as the original trials of the conspirators had been completed and the executions of 4 people, including Surratt's mother, had taken place. So even though the federal government, the U.S. federal government, knew that Surratt was in Liverpool, they actually didn't actively pursue him. And so they rescinded his reward. That was revoked on the 24th of November. So by all accounts, it appears that Father Jolivet only ever intended to shelter Surratt for a brief time, and yet Surratt he didn't feel safe, even as the political circumstances changed. So he continued on his way, going from Liverpool to Rome. And accounts suggest that Surratt was first assisted in Rome by Frederick Neve, who was rector of the English College, which hosted students for the priesthood. And so Surratt initially stayed at the college before enrolling in the Papal Zouaves forces, a military unit made up of volunteers who mobilized to defend the papal state against Italian unification forces. So he is wearing the uniform in that photo. Let me get back to, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. We're going to retrace his journey. Oh my goodness. In case you were getting bored, I just gave you a rapid fire slideshow. That is the outfit that he's wearing. That's the Papal Zouave uniform. So he is in some ways disguising himself yet again. He's with this Catholic community, but he is taking on this new role. This was a military unit made up of volunteers who mobilized to defend the papal state against Italian unification forces. The largest contingent of the Zouaves came from the Low Countries, but there were also large numbers from France, Italy, and Canada. There were significant French Canadians who enrolled as well. Surratt seems to have largely joined the forces out of a desire for anonymity and financial support, though one suspects that his Catholic faith might have also inspired some interest in this cause. His desire for anonymity seems to have held, and only 6 months later was he identified by a former schoolmate from St. Charles College. Henry Beaumont de Saint-Marie. Surratt was arrested and jailed on the 7th of November, 1866. So again, it's these connections that he made in his early school years that ultimately helped him find refuge, but then became his downfall. Still, he managed to escape and proceeded to convince the English consul in Rome that he was Canadian, perhaps using his Charlie Armstrong alias again, and he sailed shortly for the port of Alexandria. So we'll take you through his trip again. There he is getting to the port of Alexandria. He arrived, he was still wearing his uniform, and he was arrested in Alexandria. At that point, Surratt had been fleeing justice for almost a year and a half. And crucially, while there had been all kinds of networked protection for Surratt as he moved along and through Confederate and Catholic networks, there was little in the way of such protection in Alexandria. He lost his networks in Alexandria and became much more exposed, hence his arrest. He was returned to the United States, so that's the final long journey back, to face a civilian trial. A mistrial was eventually declared, and because the statute of limitations had run its course, Surratt was free to go. He chose to head south to Mexico rather than his previous haunt in Montreal, and he spent his later years on the lecture circuit in the United States, talking about his experiences, some of which included sanctuary and refuge in Canada, Europe, and not in Alexandria. Meanwhile, some of Surratt's allies, namely other Confederates, including Jefferson Davis, moved north after the war, building on long-established relations and previous supports. And so the stories around Confederate refuge or sanctuary in Canada now focus a great deal on Jefferson Davis, and particularly his time in Montreal. But it bears noting that it was in fact in Lennoxville that Davis chose to retire, sending his two sons to bishops. John Harrison Surratt did not find refuge here, but support for the Confederate cause was geographically diffuse, and Jefferson C. Davis certainly did. And there is an image from the Eastern Townships Resource Centre, two images, sorry, one of Sherbrooke in 1868, and the other an image of bishops in 1865. And I like to imagine that two of Davis's sons may have been standing in front of those doors. The characters are not identified. So the stories that I have shared tonight, I am getting to the end. I realize I've given you lots of movement and lots of histories of hiding, but I want to emphasize a few points. The stories that I've shared tonight of fugitivity and hiding, networks and community are very different in some ways from the institutionalized sanctuary that the Flores-Rodriguez family benefited from, and which is the origin of many of the contemporary efforts around protection. Yet there are certain shared elements, most notably in terms of religious and political connections, as well as community. When we talk about sanctuary, therefore, we need to be very careful not to talk only about the places where people find refuge and those involved. We also need to think very carefully about the networks and connections that make modern forms of sanctuary or refuge possible. Refuge is not guaranteed, and it takes considerable social, political, and cultural capital to obtain some kind of protection, whether from states or non-state actors. As the stories of Donald Morrison, John Surratt, and the Flores-Rodriguez family all show, refuge is contingent upon individual will and fortune, but also on a constellation of supporters. In thinking about the making of refuge, therefore, we can learn a great deal about the societies in which people moved, of who is considered worthy and deserving of protection, and how this all came about. Understanding the Confederate presence in Montreal, the Eastern Townships, and surrounds, for instance, can be a way of explaining why very few fugitive slaves made their way to these parts despite the dominant mythology of the so-called Underground Railroad in Canada. There was another form of refuge taking place in Montreal and surrounds, and that was a refuge for Confederate supporters. One of the marked differences in the experiences I have described here has to do with the publicity around each of the events described. Crucially, in the late 19th century, people sought refuge by hiding. The whole point was not to be found, not to be seen. Donald Morrison and John Surratt were wanted fugitives, and so in some ways more akin to the medieval practices of sanctuary where criminals were protected, not people who were considered innocent. And yet such refuge was not available to them. They weren't hidden in churches, though they were certainly supported by networks, some of which were very religious in nature, as was the case for John Surratt. And they ultimately relied on communities of supporters, but in order to remain safe, they certainly had to remain hidden. The situation with the Flores-Rodriguez family and many other modern cases of sanctuary is very different in this regard, and is the result of a shift in the 1980s when the churches who were declaring sanctuaries, such as Southside Presbyterian in Tucson, placed their faith in ancient traditions and in customary law, but they made the decision to make very public declarations of sanctuary in order to protect people from deportation. So it wasn't enough to only protect people in a physical space. In some ways, by publicizing these sanctuary cases, the churches were trying to build a broader network of community and support. And so this dynamic, and I know that there are people from Plymouth-Trinity here tonight, so I'm looking forward to hearing if I'm correct in understanding this. My sense is that this dynamic was very much at play in 2021 when the Flores-Rodriguez family entered Plymouth-Trinity United Church. In doing so, their story became very public and mediatized. This is how I first learned about it. We learned about their life in Mexico, their restaurant ownership in Torreon, how they were targeted by a drug cartel after they refused to take their orders to participate in the drug trade, and their long and winding process through Canada's refugee determination processes. We learned all this because the family needed to tell their story to engage the media, to buy time, and to ensure that their sanctuary would not be for naught. They were both hiding and highlighting their time in sanctuary. So I want to close with an observation on this crucial dynamic, and I'm happy to elaborate this more fully in the Q&A, which is that the experience of refuge or sanctuary is only ever one part of a person's life. Even in the stories that I told tonight around Donald Morrison and John Surratt, I was able to dive deep and think about their time in sanctuary, but I didn't tell you so much about, John Surratt's tour of Mexico after he was released after the mistrial. So there are all kinds of stories that we don't hear about or think about when we focus in on stories of sanctuary. And I think that this is a very important dimension to keep in mind as we consider the lived experience of sanctuary. One thing we must be very careful about in the present is not to lose sight of the fact that families in sanctuary are more than families in sanctuary. And this is especially true of children who will go on to lead separate, independent lives. There are stories before sanctuary, there are stories during, and there are stories after. But sanctuary is not always the defining moment. It is sometimes the way that we access these stories. So we must be very careful to see people as more than sanctuary and to let people move beyond sanctuary, if you will, just as we must look beyond cities to networks to understand the making of refuge in the past and present. So I think I will end there, and I look forward to your questions and comments. I don't know what happens now. I can.
Benefit of the live stream people, if people ask questions in the room, if you guys could just repeat the question or just summarize it, that'd be great.
You may know people better than I do, actually.
Okay, I will.
So-
David is letting me handle my own Q&A, so I'm going to do it. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, I'm taking charge.
yes, so,
Okay.
questions for Dr. Madokoro?
Jackie?
En anglais ou en français?
Anglais et français, oui.
One thing that I don't understand is what is the actual legal standing of sanctuary? I mean, we did not read about the RCMP, laying siege to the church, the Flores Rodriguez family. Nobody came in and got them or anything. So is there some legal standing for this, ancient practice?
Yeah, so the legal standing is essentially found in customary law. The tradition is so long-standing and has been so respected that the idea is that in our contemporary moment, state authorities, including the police, will not violate church sanctuary. And this has largely been the case, although there have been instances where local police in Quebec City have gone into a church and arrested someone who then faced deportation to the United States. There have been instances where non-Christian faiths have been more vulnerable to RCMP presence. And so there was an imam in Montreal who wasn't inside the mosque, but he was on the grounds of the mosque. He too was arrested. And then in BC, in Abbotsford, there was a Sikh temple which was raided by the RCMP. And that caused a real conversation around the extent to which customary law is respected. So any, and Jack can probably say more about this than I can, but in the research that I've been doing, which has involved a number of sanctuary churches in Montreal, the conversations that congregations and their leaders have are all about the dangers that are posed to the church community if they offer sanctuary to someone. So it's not a gesture that is taken lightly. In my experience, all the congregations who've offered sanctuary have had long deliberations about the merits, the dangers of doing so, and have, in some cases, decided not to do it. In other cases, the question has been for how long, and that's a complete unknown. Some sanctuary cases are resolved very quickly, a matter of hours. Other cases have gone on for, I think the longest in Canada was 7 years. It was Rodney Watson, who was a resistor to the Iraq War, the US war in Iraq, who found sanctuary in a church in Vancouver. And what was really interesting in that case was that previous people who had found refuge in Canada, most notably war resistors during the American War in Vietnam, they provided refuge to Rodney Watson. But it is a very it's a substantial undertaking, and there are many unknowns, including the question of whether or not law enforcement will violate church property. So the idea is that they won't, but there are exceptions.
Do you know of any cases where the person or family has not received sanctuary from a church, but from some other kind of organization or family, or, could I take somebody in?
Yeah. Well, I think that's so sorry. I totally forgot about the thing where I'm supposed to repeat the questions. Okay. I will repeat that question, which is such an interesting one in terms of other instances where people might find refuge beyond a church. And so I think one of the things that has happened with church sanctuary is that when it largely, it becomes quite public. And so I think there are all kinds of stories of refuge and sanctuary that we don't know about. This has been one of the great challenges of researching this history. Is when I started, I thought, surely it's been mediatized for decades. And so there were a team of researchers going through all these historical newspapers, and the reality is people don't talk about sanctuary historically because the whole point is to be hidden. And so there are examples of people who are not institutions that are not churches, and the best example is actually that of First Nations, who will adopt people into community. And it's been this really fascinating struggle between the federal government and First Nations over whether or not they have the authority to do so. And consistently, the Federal Court of Canada has said that under the Indian Act, they do not have the right to extend citizenship or Indian status to people that they might want to protect from deportation. So there was a case in 2012 of a Nigerian nun in Manitoba who was facing deportation, and she was adopted into community, and the federal court said, you do not have the authority to do that, and she was deported. So it's much more tenuous, I think, when you move beyond that conventional church framework. But we've certainly seen, in the US, there are all kinds of examples of healthcare institutions, hospitals serving as a kind of sanctuary. But yes, Glenn.
I have a question. Confusing. An online viewer, Margaret Black asks, says, thank you for a great presentation. What, in your opinion, are some of the major sanctuary cities in the world? Is there an international group advocating for sanctuary families, or is it more of a local effort?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you. There are different kinds of networks, and I would say that in some ways the networks that connect sanctuary cities operate almost below that level of declaration. So it's church networks or activist networks, so solidarity across borders. There is a really interesting example of a network called the Cities of Refuge, which French philosopher Jacques Derrida was very much involved with, the idea that cities should be refuge for writers, for creators. It's like this ominous, for those online, there's this ominous opening of some kind of window in the back as we talk about refuge and solidarity. So the sanctuary city movement really is, in some ways, an American phenomenon. It really gained a lot of traction in the context of the Trump administration. So it will be interesting to see what happens in 2024, not to be foreboding about it, but it will be interesting to see. But the extent to which things are organized, it really is below the network, the Sanctuary City network. It's really amongst activists, and the religious networks are still very strong. So Southside Presbyterian, which was one of those churches, it was the original church to declare sanctuary, is still doing a lot of work for refugees on the U.S.-Mexico border. Yes, Mary.
I'm a little troubled by your Surratt story because it strikes me, it raises the question, is anyone who is fleeing the law and goes into hiding a candidate for sanctuary? And it strikes me he was just a man evading the law. And when we think of sanctuary today, we think of it as being a kind of humanitarian project. It's very much driven by some kind of moral perspective and the need to protect the vulnerable and the unjustly treated. There was no indication he was being unjustly treated at all. He was just running.
Yeah.
So how does he fit the model of the person or family who is a reasonable candidate for sanctuary?
Yeah, so another great question, which I'll abbreviate for the online audience, just in terms of Surratt. Surratt was not an innocent person, right? And not somebody who we would consider worthy of sanctuary. He's been accused of a major crime. And this, to me, is one of the fundamental differences, and I think really worth underscoring in terms of past practices and contemporary practices. So in the medieval context, it wasn't for innocent people. It was for people who had committed crimes, and they were in sanctuary to either achieve some kind of peaceful resolution. Some of them were abjured from the realm. They were sent away from England after sanctuary. So sanctuary in the medieval context was not a happy, beautiful story about innocent people. It was a criminal justice mechanism. And the focus now, and it's been very much the case since the 1980s, where sanctuary is about innocence. And I think it has a lot to do with that 1980s moment, which was so driven by the brutal American policies in Central America, where what activists saw in the United States and in Canada was injustices that were being perpetuated by their governments, coming home in a sense in terms of refugees and migrants. And so the emphasis became very, very much on people who were deserving of sanctuary, who were unjustly treated by immigration and refugee determination systems, or were having to flee their homelands because of something that domestic governments had done. And what was interesting about the 1980s moment was that was a moment where sanctuary became quite public. And so and there was a real tension within the movement. So this was a national movement, and in some ways a continental movement, because it extended both into Canada and Mexico. And there were real tensions about what should be asked of those in sanctuary. And so there's a so-called Chicago school, and also the activists in Arizona, and they're really sort of divided along these two lines, because what the Chicago school wanted to do was really use the testimonies of refugees to advocate for change with the U.S. government. And that meant that they were vetting the refugees in a sense to find out their stories, to make sure they were innocent, that they could present their stories to the public. And I think a lot of that has carried over into our present day, where if a church is going to offer sanctuary, one of the conversations that happens is around how deserving is this person. They're not going to offer sanctuary to someone who might not have legitimate claims, because that makes the church look bad. And one of the things that's been striking about using Montreal as a case study over 200 years is you see the shifting role of religion, right? Montreal was the city of spires, the churches were everywhere, and of course we live in well, I don't live in Quebec anymore, unfortunately, but we live, in a climate where the secular religious question is quite fraught. The role of the church has changed dramatically, as has its influence. So it still has a lot of moral influence. But when a church undertakes sanctuary, it is also asking questions about the potential impact on the church. So I think that has everything to do with the kind of questions about deservedness. But you're absolutely right. Surratt was not a desirable person in many ways. And Donald Morrison, and this is where I may get in trouble with some of the locals, the stories that I grew up with were, Donald Morrison, the deserving individual, I don't think he was always that nice. I think he might have been quite difficult, but you don't hear that in the stories that people tell about sanctuary because it's about a deserved protection. So I have gotten into trouble, I will say, by including Surratt's case in this larger story of sanctuary, but I really think it's an important one because it speaks to this difference around the willingness to protect certain people, but also who has the capacity to do so, right?
Yeah, just to pick up on that a minute, it struck me as you were talking about Surratt that the protection offered him had less to do with religion at all than it had to do with politics, and that the people who were protected him were people who shared his political sympathies, even the British who might have shared those political sympathies, and again, you know, I just wonder how that plays into the whole this process you say now a church might go through. It may also have relate to politics. There's a real blurring of lines, it seems to me.
Yeah, and I think that's where there's the closest connection in terms of these original medieval traditions, right? It is around the relationship between state authority and churches or religious authorities, and I think those have shifted. But you know, the Surratt story is so fascinating to me because it's obviously a political story, but the fact that he relies on these religious connections that come out of his school years is really fascinating. And somebody, as I was talking about this a few months ago, somebody made the point that Louis Riel does the same thing when he is exiled to the United States, that he's relying on religious connections, and obviously connections amongst Indigenous peoples, but the religious networks are also there because of his studies in Montreal. And so the question of, and I guess it's fitting to be talking about this, you know, here at Bishop's, an educational institution, thinking about the kinds of connections and networks that are being built here and the ways that they might play out in future years. So that's an invitation for all of you to consider your networks. Yes.
I was wondering where a country would fall into. I was thinking of the group of draft dodgers of the Vietnam that settled just past Sawyerville.
Yeah.
Now, can a country offer sanctuary, or is that just refusing extradition?
Yeah, so Canada's, oh, sorry.
People are causing noise online, but all good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the question is about whether or not a country can offer sanctuary, and absolutely. It tends to be described as asylum as opposed to sanctuary, and so there are, and that's another, you know, we can have a whole conversation around language and the terms that we get used. And I will say that when I started this research, when I was translating it into French, it was really fascinating because I was asking, you know, these local archives about these histoires de sanctuaire, and they were like, oh no, sanctuaire is the part of, it's the sanctuary in the church, it's refuge. But now the language has shifted, and they will talk about ville sanctuaire. You know, when Montreal declared itself a sanctuary city, it was ville sanctuaire. So there's all kinds of fluidity. Anyway, that is not your question. Your question is about asylum, and certainly countries will offer asylum. And I think there's probably a really interesting project to explore in terms of when countries publicize their asylum and when they keep it low key. So Edward Snowden has been somebody who's mentioned again and again when I talk about sanctuary and refuge. And I think, so in the context of the war resistors from Vietnam, it changed in terms of the willingness of the Canadian state to, the Canadian state never closed its borders, but after, there was a certain moment where Trudeau Sr. said, you know, we're willing to accept war resistors, and it became, but there was a whole language there around who was a deserter, who was a dodger, but certainly to answer your question in a very short and succinct way, yes, countries can offer refuge, but it's called asylum generally. Yeah. Yes, Glenn, online.
There we have another question online. This one's from Charles Neville Ross. He asks, how long were refuges in the Plymouth Church in Sherbrooke?
2 years, is that right? 14 months. Oh, sorry. Yes, I was thinking they came out last year. Yeah. So and I do want to hear more of this story. I think the longer a family or individual is in refuge, the larger the toll. And I'll be curious to hopefully, Jack, talk with you about this, because one of the themes that's come out in the research is this question of churches as being in fact carceral spaces where people are not free because they can't leave for fear of being apprehended by Canadian Border Services. So in one of the cases I looked at in Montreal, the sanctuary, I think similarly, lasted about 14 months, and that was never at all the intention. And this was an elderly woman, so the questions of, caring and how isolated she was in sanctuary were really, really prominent. But yes, so thank you for clarifying 14 months. It's a long one, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a question at the back and then the right.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in the relationship between sanctuary and the government and policing. So was there, once a sanctuary was recognized as harboring an individual, was there an increase in surveillance or policing around that area? What did that relationship look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is about the relationship between government and sanctuary and policing, and whether or not there's more of a police presence after a sanctuary is known. I think in the case of Donald Morrison, that police presence was already there. He was already in hiding. In terms of more contemporary events, I'll use the example of this church in Montreal where this elderly woman was in sanctuary for about a year. And the minister there, Chris Berger, who's just been an incredibly generous interviewee, talked about, at a certain point, he realized that Canadian Border Services was outside. There were these two black cars. I mean, it sounds like a Hollywood movie, the way he talks about it, that all of a sudden there were these dark cars on the street, and he went out and offered them coffee as a way of letting them know that he knew they were there. So there was like, we're watching you, and I'm watching you back. So that's anecdotal. I suspect that in some cases, depending on how the narrative is unfolding in the media, perhaps there is more of a police presence. There's a case in Montreal that lasted 4 years, and I don't think there was very much police presence by the end. It was so protracted. But thank you for that question. It's really interesting. Yeah. And there was a question at the front. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. See, Glenn's giving me the, make sure you repeat the question. It's a great question about foreign embassies having the power to protect and why you would choose a church over an embassy. And I think that's such an important question. The example that comes to mind, and again, it's another chapter from the book, which as I describe it, you'll see why I keep thinking about connections and networks. So in Chile, after the coup in 1973, many people tried to seek refuge in embassies because what they were trying to do was get out of the country. And there were legal conventions in Latin America that meant that embassies were safe spaces. They also tried to hide in churches, but the church was considered leftist and was targeted by the Pinochet regime. So in some cases, in that particular context, it was much safer to seek refuge in an embassy. In the Canadian context, there was a Canadian embassy in Santiago, and the ambassador at the time really didn't want people in the embassy, so he was doing all kinds of things to try and discourage people from coming in, putting security guards in front of the doors. There were stories of people jumping over the gardens at the residence to try and access the embassy. And so I think in some contexts, it's a matter of perception, right? Where do you think you're going to be safest? And the embassy is a very, very good example if you want protection from a government that you feel is targeting you and you need to get out of country. So chapter 5 in Sanctuary and Peace is about Chilean refugees seeking refuge in embassies and ultimately then occupying churches in Montreal to make their case. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about the relationship between sanctuary cities and individual incidents of sanctuary and the kinds of pressures at play, right? Where if someone is going into sanctuary in a church, for instance, the idea is that they're much more vulnerable to immediate deportation, whereas in the context of sanctuary cities, that deportation can come about because up until a certain point, somebody's status has not been known to authorities. And then once they encounter, whether it's law enforcement or school boards, that status becomes known. And it is, I think it's a really helpful observation. I think there are a number of ways in which these two dynamics intersect. One is that a lot of the activism around sanctuary cities is born of particular incidents. So in the Montreal case, there were a lot of people who lobbied for sanctuary city status that had been involved in individual church activism or in organizations like Solidarity Across Borders, which has long argued for migrant justice. Yeah, I don't know. I think that's such an important observation. I do think that they are very, very different. And I think probably the motivations, that immediacy does change the question of what's at play. I guess what I would say is, if we think about both of these dynamics, in some ways, what they are speaking to in their own respective ways is a question of structures, the structures in which people move and settle and feel safe. And so there's been quite a large body of criticism about sanctuary cities with the idea that in making these declarations, they appear to be safe when in fact they're not. So we know in the Montreal case that the Montreal police was still giving information to Canadian Border Services. So people still were being deported even though they thought they were in this safe city. So did that structurally change things, or did that simply present a nice image of what the city of Montreal was? That's a very cynical take, but it is one of the critiques that has been leveled. What is the purpose of these declarations? Who is ultimately served by them? In some ways, when individuals and families go into church sanctuary, you can see the immediacy of that action. And I wonder if it maybe doesn't change structurally in such an obvious way, but I suspect that over time it actually has changed the structures in which people move. But I'll have to think about that further. I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
There's been some really great questions, but if there's nothing pressing, then
I could talk about sanctuary all day, so you do have to stop me. Yeah.
I don't want you to be here till 10.
I have no idea what time it is, so yeah.
It's not close to 10.
Okay.
So you're all right. But I don't know if we don't have any other questions at the moment, then I'll just take the opportunity to say thank you to Laura. I'll come close to the mic so that way people online. No, you can stay. Just to say, my name is Jody Robinson. I'm the executive director of the ETRC, and I'm just wanted to thank everyone who came out tonight. It's been fantastic. Your questions have been so thoughtful and thought-provoking as well. Thank you so much, Laura. This has been fascinating. I'm particularly very excited that you're doing stuff on war resistors from the Vietnam War. I've wanted something on it for so long, so that's fantastic. Can't wait to read it when it comes out. Thank you for coming from Carleton and being with us tonight and presenting on this super fascinating topic with so many layers. I really appreciate it. On behalf of everyone, thank you. And for those not on our online audience, I have drink tickets. So please, you're more than welcome to get a ticket from me, and then you can have either wine or beer or a soft drink if you wish, and you're more than welcome to stay and chat amongst yourselves with Laura and continue some of these discussions. It's been a lovely evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much.